And one night late it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but this is how it came. One, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. Two, that we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals. That would be bad business and discreditable. It's interesting that God takes an interest in these things. Three, that we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was. And four, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. Remember, the Philippines are 90% Catholic at this point. And by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. McKinley's sleep was soon to be disturbed by a full-scale insurrection in the Philippines, led by guerrilla warriors for whom the President's benevolent assimilation proclamation of 1899 was anything but. Having no wish to be assimilated, they turned their weapons on their erstwhile liberators. The insurrection dragged on for 5 years, producing an American casualty list 10 times the number killed in the original conflict. Sound familiar? Don't tell me history doesn't repeat itself. McKinley was the last Civil War soldier to be president. It's interesting, his successor was Teddy Roosevelt, a very belligerent man, and yet the president who would become the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Teddy Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., had not fought in the Civil War. In fact, he had taken advantage of a loophole in the law that allowed him for $300 to purchase a substitute. It's extraordinary to stop and think. During the Civil War, basically when Lincoln was in desperate need of manpower, the law was passed. For $300, if you could buy someone's heroism, that was fine. That's what T.R. Sr. did. And there are those Freudians, I'm not one of them, but there are all sorts of psychohistorians who believe that Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was branded for life by the sense that his father had not done his duty. Certainly he acted like a man possessed during his brief military career in the Spanish-American War and what he famously called my crowded hour on San Juan Hill, which was in many ways the making of the rest of his political career. And yet in office, surprisingly, this bloodthirsty belligerent was a peacemaker. Likewise, counterintuitive. In the 20th century, it took a five-star general named Eisenhower to prevent the nuclear arms race from spinning out of control after the launch of a Russian satellite 50 years ago named Sputnik, and to warn his countrymen of a military-industrial complex bent on shaping American policy and culture in the Cold War. His performance certainly surpassed the expectations of Harry Truman, a not altogether unbiased observer, who had predicted that Ike's military background would be his undoing in the Oval Office. He'll sit right here and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Truman told members of his White House staff, poor Ike, it won't be a bit like the Army. He'll find it very frustrating. It's not as if Truman, a one-time military officer in World War I, hadn't experienced frustrations of his own. In fact, it's Truman who gave us the most celebrated definition of the modern presidency, which he said was akin to riding a tiger. This is no exaggeration. Taking office on the death of Franklin Roosevelt, Truman knew nothing of war strategy. He didn't know about the existence of the Manhattan Project or the atomic bomb in embryo that would compel Japan's surrender and open the door to American occupation. He could scarcely imagine, nor could anyone really at that point, how the end of one war, World War II, would quickly usher in the start of another, the Cold War, with recent allies turned into adversaries and the former haberdasher from Kansas City undergoing a fiery trial of his own. Necessity mothered invention. People still look at the Truman presidency as maybe the most creative in modern American history. For example, Truman established the CIA, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, the largest government reorganization in history, until something called the Homeland Security Department came along in response to the 9/11 threat. But his creativity was not just in terms of organization building. Truman, and this is a particularly relevant lesson here in Grand Rapids, because of course this is the hometown of Arthur Vandenberg, Truman practiced creative diplomacy on Capitol Hill, as well as in Europe. The White House convinced Republican leaders to adjourn partisanship with a very big help from Senator Vandenberg, and to embrace the Truman Doctrine, which committed the United States to oppose the spread of communism, first in Greece and Turkey, and eventually across the globe. Military alliances like NATO were created. The Marshall Plan authorized the virtual reconstruction of Europe. Truman launched the Berlin airlift at a particularly delicate moment in the Cold War to sustain that beleaguered and symbolic city after the Soviets had moved to isolate it from the outside world. Under Truman, communist containment became the West's defining mission. When troops from communist North Korea invaded the South in June 1950, Truman redefined the meaning of war itself. First, he went to the young United Nations. Now remember, the UN is brand new. This is 5 years after the end of World War II, when people saw a peace treaty signed on board a ship, a very clean end to a very long and very ugly war. That's what war was. That's how war ended. Well, then came something called the United Nations and the atomic bomb. And the existence of those two realities transformed war in Truman's time, and in fact, in our own. He goes to the United Nations, first of all, for sanction of what he calls a police action. He redefines war. War isn't war the way we fought it in World War I or World War II. War is a police action, a limited action that is designed to restore the status quo ante. In other words, we're not trying to defeat or eliminate North Korea, let alone their allies in Moscow and Beijing. We're trying to push them back across the 38th parallel and to make sure that aggression is not rewarded. That may not sound radical to you, but I guarantee you it was a radical departure from the norm to most people in 1950. It's one reason why the Korea War was never popular, why Truman had the lowest public approval ratings in polls ever measured, particularly after he did the most courageous thing of his presidency and fired his general, his commanding general in Korea, Douglas MacArthur, to uphold the principle of civilian supremacy. MacArthur did not understand the police action. MacArthur said in war there is no substitute for victory. And his definition of victory was a Victorian one, with bugles blowing and flags flying. But the fact is, it is Truman who really redefined not only war, but victory itself. Now, he also gave us what some people call the national security state. It is a mixed record. People admire Truman's assertiveness. They admire his ability to make decisions. They tend to forget sometimes that assertiveness was directed against people who weren't obviously enemies. The Supreme Court, for example, slapped him down and slapped him down hard in 1952 when he seized the steel mills in this country as a wartime measure, because threats of strikes threatened the war effort in Korea. Earlier than that, he'd actually gone to Congress to ask them to draft coal miners who were striking, railroad workers who were striking, because in those days the railroads were also in effect wartime industries. So the question arises, which Harry Truman are we to assess? Is it the Truman who boldly, courageously stood up and creatively stood up to the aggression from North Korea? Or is it the same Truman who boldly, aggressively played fast and loose, arguably, with basic constitutional liberties as a measure of wartime necessity?